allegiance. I'm going to ask Mrs. Mary LeClaire to lead us in the pledge this evening.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. As I said, there's only one item on the agenda this evening, which is to continue our discussions from our last meeting related to the Fairfield-Ludlow High School Building Committee project, or the building project, and the Fairfield-Ludlow High School Building Committee is here. I want to thank the gentleman from the Building Committee for being here this evening. Thank our attorney for being here this evening, our bond attorney. I know this has been a long and winding road. We appreciate your dedication to the project. We appreciate the good work that's been done so far. I do want to make note of the fact that although we're asking a lot of questions about this, although we're digging deep into what happened, do realize that this was an $11 million project, or $11.6 million budget, that went over budget by $3.9 million. So we're not looking for recrimination. We're not looking for to cast aspersions or blame. We're certainly appreciative of the time and effort of the volunteers that worked on this project. But it is incumbent upon us to understand lessons learned so that we don't have a problem like this again, because this is a significant overage of what we originally thought this project was going to cost. So I hope nobody's taking anything personally. I hope we're not hurting anybody's feelings. I hope we're keeping this professional. And I hope we learn a lot of lessons from this that'll help us as we move forward with other building projects, as we most certainly have on the docket moving forward. And I just wanted to make sure that gets out there, because sometimes these meetings run a little bit long. The discussions get a little bit heated at times, and the questions certainly get a little bit pointed. And we're all in this together, and we're all just trying to do what's right for the town and for the taxpayers. With that, before I turn it over, I've got two statements I'd like to make, or items of business I'd like to take care of. The first is I'd like to congratulate Mrs. LeClaire and her husband Brian on her daughter's graduation from college yesterday with two big awards, and she'll be a civil engineer coming up here real soon. So congratulations to you. That's a great achievement, and I know you and Brian are very proud of her. Secondly, and more sadly, it is to note that Mr. Stone, who's been a long-serving member of this board, I think going on 8 years, is taking his leave of us and has turned in his resignation. So this evening will be his last Board of Finance meeting. He tells me that it's not because he dislikes us, but more so he's doing some things with his home that needs his attention and his place of residence. And at his request, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can address the board in however you want.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is, it's been a great 8 years. I really, before this I was on the RTM, and that was a learning experience. But this was really something that people, I wish, would pay attention to, because this is where a lot of the work is done, where things get really discussed, and I'm proud to be on this board. The one regret I have is that I think it's become political, a little bit too political the last couple of years, and I hope that stops. But basically, I think we ask some really good questions. We do our job, and I think most of us really have the town's interest at heart. The other thing is, this is an example of what we're doing tonight, the building committee and going over Ludlow and everything. I'm very proud of what we do, and I'm very proud of the questions we ask. Sometimes I think we go overboard, and I don't think the job of the Board of Finance is to micromanage these projects. That's why you have a building committee, but it is to oversee them. We do have to appropriate the money. And I just want to say I've enjoyed working with all of you and the people that were here before me, Mr. Bolito, Mr. Mayor, who was on it, and Mr. Tetro. It's and Mr. Brackfeld, he's probably watching. So I just want to say how much I enjoyed it and working with you. And even though I sold my house, I'm such a good realtor, but even though we sold the house, and I am moving to Vermont, but not permanently. We will be back. We'll start looking for something. We didn't expect to sell the house so quickly. So we'll be, I'll still be around to keep you all on your toes. But again, I want to thank you all for a wonderful 8 years. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Stone, and thanks for the warning that you'll be coming back. That's, appreciated. Does anybody have anything they'd like to say at this point? Mr.
I
Leclerc.
just would tell Mr. Stone that it's been a pleasure working with you, and we will miss you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Anyone else? Mr. DeWitt.
Words. How can I not say a few words, Mr. Stone? It was a pleasure running against you and with you in elections, and it's always been interesting conversation and always collaborative. So we'll definitely miss you.
Mr. Stone, thank you for your service, your friendship, your typical good humor. It's been a lot of fun. We made some tough decisions. I think we've done some good work for the town in a collaborative spirit. We wish you the best. We look forward to seeing you around town come the fall. And thank your wife for us, for your wife and your daughters, actually, for sharing you with us. Because they're the ones, as I've said before, whether it be with Mr. Flato or some of the others that have retired, they're the ones who actually give the sacrifice of not having their loved one at home.
I don't know if my wife sees it that way.
Well, if I was married to you, maybe I wouldn't either. But thanks for everything, and we'll see you around. All right, to the business at hand. To hear, consider, and adopt a bond resolution entitled, "A Resolution Amending and Restating a Resolution Adopted by the Representative Town Meeting on June 24, 2013, entitled, "A Resolution Appropriating $1,630,000 for the costs associated with the expansion and renovation of the Fairfield Ludlow High School, and authorizing the issuance of bonds to finance such appropriation to increase the amount of the appropriation and bond authorization by $3,907,674. This motion is already before us because it comes from last meeting. Mr. Tetro, you asked if you could say a few words before we started this evening, so feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to, based on some of the comments and questions, and kind of where some of the conversation went, thought it might be good to add some perspective or some positioning when we look at this project. Because this is certainly a unique project. It's not something that we haven't done. We tried to do a few different things on this, and
Yeah, is your microphone picking you up? I was thinking the same thing. Thank you, Mr. Dwyer.
you know, I haven't had this problem before, but
Yeah, use your outside voice.
I will try. But from a standpoint of project background, this is a project with a couple unique characteristics, and I just kind of wanted to put those in perspective a little bit. One is that the concept approach we used on this is where it was a suggestion by Dr. Title with concurrence of this board and every other board, because we talked about that when we did the initial positioning, that we'd, in essence, spend a bit more money on the architect to get a little bit better design, hopefully get some better concept numbers out, so we'd have a better understanding of where that was. Second, and one of the things that I think that added some complexity, is that we really have three projects in one. We talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but it's not like building the first floor, second floor, third floor of a building. These are really three independent projects. And I think that complicated some of the reporting. And then we also had a very strict deadline for at least one of the phases. Phase 2, the middle one, the classrooms and the cafeteria. We had an overriding concern of getting that ready for September 1st of 2015, and that was something that was repeated both by the Board of Ed, but also by the principal and everybody else through this project. As we mentioned last time, it was in a June-July timeframe that was an update to myself that the project looked to be over budget, and it looked the initial challenges of trying to refine the scope didn't help. I did contact the chair of the Board of Finance on that, but I'd gone back to my guidance to the building committee was to say either cut scope or we've got to go back to the boards for more dollars at that. The initial feedback from the building committee from when they took it over was that the concept design doesn't look like it would work based on the need to use the courtyard. They found that an issue with respect to logistically building it. The other component that was repeated through the updates that we had was that there were costs missing from the original concept. And I think this is something that we certainly want to take a look at in terms of lessons learned. There were also, as we found, PCBs in both Phase 1 and Phase 2, and that caused a major delay in Phase 2 and Phase 3, rather, and that caused a major delay in Phase 3 with the windows, having to go out to the EPA to get final approval on the mitigation plan for that. And that was the last phase that was finished just recently. After the July update,
July of what year, though,
July
right?
of 14, I believe.
Right,
That's when you and I talked.
right.
Through August and September, as much as the committee tried, they didn't get any improvement in the cost numbers. In October, we had a Board of Selectmen update, and that had the building committee, even at that point, still looking to get lower costs. And as part of that, we did request at that time that the building committee get back to the various boards with updates. They didn't have final numbers at that point. At that point in time, the revised roof bid was just coming back in. The Phase 2, the classrooms and cafeteria bid, had not gone out or come back yet. And the windows were still waiting for EBA approval on the mitigation plan. So with no final numbers, that's one of the complications, that we had one phase that we would be getting bids on shortly, but the other two phases, we still didn't have hard numbers on or any bid numbers. Compared to your typical project, where it's bid all at once, you get the numbers all back, you then can work with it. Because of that, we also then talked to the building committee about the difficulty of that is trying to get new numbers when we don't have a hard number to ask for in terms of going back to the other bids. So the challenge was then to look at getting a scope change or a spec change from the Board of Ed so that the windows would be optional as opposed to required. Because if the numbers, the estimates held at that point, this project was severely over budget. There was also an additional Board of Selectmen update on 11/19. So the Board of Selectmen actually met on this project more than any other that I remember, both October and November, and then in the spring in February, and again in March. The Phase 2 classroom bids didn't come back until December, and a couple of those were higher than expected, so they even came back and did a revised bid as of December 24th. Again, that's 2014. Now, the delivery date for this September 1st, 2015, is just 9 months away at that point. This project had a very tight deadline from day one, and that complicated the issue of sitting down, reviewing it, and looking at any revised plans. And December 30th, the building committee at their meeting did confirm they would reach out to other boards and update them as to where we are. In the February and then March meetings, the Board of Selectmen did details review with the building committee as to what was driving the overages, what was taking place in each phase, and things that were discussed were things from they were still looking at, as late as March, looking at refining the design for lower costs. So it was clear that they mentioned the expansion of the cafeteria and the complexity of the cafeteria were two of the things that were drivers for the increased cost over the original estimate. They did talk about not using the original estimate, A, because there was a 2% cost differential at the initial scope, and B, because there were so many missing costs that were part of that, due to the fact that the concept design and the concept numbers were missing many of the detailed cost estimates that build up to that. We also, based on where we were in the additional detail we're looking for in terms of learning from this, in terms of what took place and what we could do differently going forward. I did convene a meeting with the chair, with the project leaders, the chair, construction manager, Sal Morabito, Bob Mayer, invited Jim Bradley and Steve Pintanello, because of their background, to join us to review the project history and look for what we could learn out of this. And
When was that, Mr. Tetra? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
that was in the spring of 2015, I'm going to say March and April,
Okay.
roughly. We met a couple different meetings, and they were extensive meetings in doing that. The concept estimates didn't really help. We thought we were doing a good thing in terms of spending some more money to get more detail on that, but it doesn't look like that we can prove that that was effective. And interestingly enough, this project, which was really 3 projects, on the roof, the estimates were way off. On the construction, in the cafeteria and the classrooms, they were off. And also on the windows and the PCB mitigation are off. So 3 different types of projects, and we still had a significant variation. I also think that you also got into a little bit of an architect versus architect on this, having dueling architects, if you will, in terms of what the best approach is in taking place. And again, one of the lessons learned, what I'd like to do is put together an approach where the town actually hires the owner's rep and hires the architect. So we don't get into this type of architect versus architect in the future. That we have consistency of both throughout, that we still go out to bid, but hire a firm or 2 firms to handle a number of our projects so that we have more control from that. And we don't put the volunteers on a building committee in the difficult position of one of their first tasks, as they're just getting their arms around things, to go out and hire an owner's rep and an architect on projects like this. And I think that would help going forward. I think the idea of having 3 different types of projects combined into one is something we don't want to do again. If we looked at this with 20/20 hindsight, we might have taken a look at the critical deadline, which is September 1st, and so let's do just the classrooms and let's do just the criteria. Second priority might be doing the roof, because we had some significant roof issues, and then get into the windows and the PCBs, because we had a little bit more time flexibility in terms of addressing those. And the other issue, based on some of the concerns that were brought up here, going back to the 2007 building guideline report that Mr. Chair, you were part of in putting
Yep.
together, it does mention in there it would be possible for the Board of Finance to have a liaison on some of these. And not that you want to necessarily have a liaison on every single building committee that comes up. But if we identify, as we did, that this one is having some budget struggles, it might be a time that's appropriate looking forward, if we have another project like that, for somebody from this committee, if they chose to be a liaison to that, to create a little bit closer communication. I think that's just from a perspective on that. Wanted to set that up. As I look back, one of the questions was in the Board of Selectmen involvement, and we met 5 different times with updates from the committee on this. 4 that I mentioned, and the 5th time in July of 15, a couple months before the project was due. And that's more than we have on any other project that I remember in the past.
One of the problems you identified was they couldn't come back before the boards for additional funding because they didn't know how much it was going to cost. Is that correct?
That and timing, yes.
So
The
so
tight
they didn't know
timeline-
what they were asking for.
The tight timeline, if you go back from.
I
early-
understand that. I understand that. I
So
just,
any delay, if they stopped that process, waited a couple months for all that to happen, that would be difficult. But they also, never had a price for Phase 3. The Phase 2 price was finalized December 24th, and even the roof bids that went out came back, revised, it was September or October that they had final numbers on Phase 1.
okay. Thank you. Questions, comments on what the first selectman said, and then we can get back into the presentation itself? Mrs. Leclerc?
I guess I have a few areas of concern that are troubling to me on the whole process. And between our last meeting and tonight, I went back and spent a couple nights reading all the minutes for all the building committee meetings, and it was quite interesting and how the whole process evolved. But the one thing that concerns me is that right from the start, like when the funds were approved and all through the minutes, it was pretty clear that there were 3 projects, and funds were allotted for all 3 projects. And how, after we approve a bond resolution that was for all 3 projects, that it would be okay, and right through the minutes, it's pretty clear that the building committee thought it was okay to just not do the windows and to go back to the Board of Ed to get the ed specs changed. And that's troubling to me that that could happen after we approve funding that we think is being spent on something and then it's not. And how do we deal with that?
I think one is we don't combine 3 projects like this ever again. That's the simplest way to do that.
But for reimbursement, don't we need a building committee for all 3 of those type of projects?
We do. We just don't combine them in one project.
Yeah, but it doesn't stop the problem from even if there's elements of a project. If we think we're paying for 10 classrooms.
We are paying for it. The issue is the original estimate.
No, but whether it's 3 projects together or 1 project combined, right? However you say it, fine. You want to break this into 3 discrete projects? Fine, right? The reality is, we allocated funds and thought we were going to get something for those funds. We didn't get the full complement of what we thought we were going to get. And Mrs. Leclerc's point is that very early on, it was reasonably to assume that we weren't going to get all 3 elements. Correct?
I don't know how, after a year or so.
Right.
It took a while.
I understand, but it was early on in terms of there was no shovels in the ground.
Right.
Significant dollars hadn't been spent yet.
Not yet, no.
Right.
Correct. Yeah, that's the tight time frame this was on. I mean, again, the roof criteria didn't come in. Roof bids didn't come back until September, October. The Phase 2 quotes didn't come back till December. So it was in a November, December timeframe that the building committee went back to the Board of Ed and asked for the spec change. At that point, they couldn't come back and go through the boards because they didn't have pricing to get a larger
Right.
dollar amount approved. So the only approach then, in order to meet the September 1st deadline with the other project, if they weren't all in one project, if the amount approved originally in the concept design was actually closer to reality,
No, I guess, but the point is, what's to stop another building committee, right, in the future from saying if we felt we were allocating $10 million to build out 12 classrooms, and it came out that, they wanted to spend the $10 million to build 7 classrooms and not give us the other 5 classrooms, what's to stop them from doing that? See what I'm saying? I mean,
Right.
that's the point. Even you're being very specific to this project. I think the question is more, hey, moving forward, when we greenlight a project at X millions of dollars, how do we know we're going to get exactly what we paid for when we greenlight the X millions of dollars?
I think because moving forward, we're going to want to make sure that we get bids back in looking at what takes place on that. And I think the issue is, if you look at the number of projects we've done over time, when we get a bid price back, we very seldom do not hit that bid price.
Okay, but at that
The-
point, it's within the building committee's purview to do
Correct.
whatever they want.
And they've generally delivered on the ed spec, and that's the other key. It's got to be within the ed spec.
But in this instance, they had the ed spec changed.
Correct. So obviously, the Board of Ed was okay with that from a functional standpoint.
Well, they're not okay with it. I mean, realistically, they're here asking for another $4 million.
Yeah, that was, and that was because these 3 projects were combined. In order for Phase 2 to hit the September 1st deadline,
Yeah.
that project had to go first, and that was the overriding priority for what was taking place here.
So,
If you're looking for an absolute, I don't know of a building committee that can guarantee to get everything done within the number that's originally bid,
But appropriated.
appropriated. I think the idea is to make sure that we have better estimates so that we have a better shot at doing that and realizing.
So your whole thing is you think the estimates on this were just wrong?
Well, there were 3 types of projects: a roof, construction, and windows. And all 3 were significantly off. I mean, we weren't close.
Well, the roof came in close
No, it
at the
didn't.
end. Well, it did at the end, right? We were told that the $4 million was the classroom and the
Just- if you let me-
cafeteria.
I'm going to say no to that, but let me explain, because I understand where you're coming from, so it's we're both right. So let me explain that. The roof, as originally spec'd, was 2-ply,
Right,
right? That bid came in significantly
Right.
over. If it wasn't for the grant, putting solar panels on there, being able to change the spec to a
Right.
1-ply, and use the solar panels to, in essence, become the 2nd-ply, which we got for free, so we didn't have to pay for those.
yep,
So in that sense, the eventual price, we're close, you are correct.
right,
If we did it the way it was originally spec'd, no, we're not, we're way off.
got it. Mrs. Claire, did you have any other comments? I don't want to cut you off.
Another one is the cost to fast-track the project. Yeah, we had people working 7 days a week for a while to get the school open on time, and I guess, how much did that increase the whole cost of the project? And with hindsight, did it really need to be fast-tracked? Would we have saved a lot more money if we had it, I guess?
I think that's a building committee question.
Okay.
Right, so I think from the first part of it is, do we want to have a lessons learned?
Yep.
I guess this is for you, Mr. Flynn. Do we want a lessons learned, or do we want to pull apart this specific project? Because I have some definite reactions to comments about the windows being pushed back, and we know we're getting the money, therefore, that which is, quite frankly, far from the case. The reason you don't see the windows being discussed throughout the project over and over is the distance from environmental testing to results getting back to it going and sitting on somebody's desk in Boston. So we had to continue that process, going back and forth between testing, going through different substrates, et cetera. So, you know, in terms of month to month, we didn't always have new information or more information. So it's difficult with that. In terms of the timeline, the superintendent and selectmen and I sat and we met with others, and there was urgency around that September 1 deadline. And so that was part of the factor in our decisions and then in having people. Could we have saved money? Yes, probably a significant amount. Is it $4 million? No, I don't think so.
Can we ask a question on that?
Of course.
Just so that we get clarification, it's probably not for you, but to the Board of Education or whoever, whichever representative has the information. When the project first started, what was the enrollment at that school? And what was the enrollment now after the project is done?
I think that's definitely a Board of Ed question.
Right, I think so too. I just want to know, you know, when we started this, what was the project, what was the number? When we ended it, what's the number? We have it?
Yeah, the school was at about 1,500 students at the time the project was authorized, and it's at about that same number now. Really hasn't moved around very much at Ludlow.
So why was the urgency to get it done so quick?
Bill, because what was happening was that we were running out of space, particularly running out of science labs. We were in a position where, as kids were moving through, they were not going to be able to get science classes because there were not going to be any labs. We were going to implement a schedule that would allow every student to have a lunch for the first time ever, and the cafeteria wasn't big enough to support that. And it was an overcrowded situation that was only going to continue to worsen.
But
So, the enrollment didn't go up any higher, but it was a really bad situation that needed to be remedied as quickly as possible.
As I recall, I kept on hearing, kids are coming, kids are coming, kids are coming.
Right.
That wasn't true. The kids were already there, and we were delivering the program and
But it
now
was,
we're roughly the
but it
same.
was, but there were huge problems with it, and it was, we were running up, and, you know, yeah, delivery gigs, we had no choice. But we were running into, you know, major bottlenecks, clogs, had students at the school at that time. It was really a bad situation, and the science labs were the worst part of it. So there really was, you know, an overcrowded situation. It'd been overcrowded for a number of years. This wasn't just something that suddenly happened. And so we were going to implement the new schedule at both high schools simultaneously. And so we didn't want to do it at Ward and not at Ludlow. And there was no way to fit the kids in the lunchroom with the current size of the cafeteria. And when the cafeteria was designed, and then it had to be value engineered, it actually scaled back the size of the cafeteria just barely enough to fit all the kids. And even now, it barely fits all the kids in the cafeteria at Ludlow. So for more specifics on the crowding and how that played out, Mr. Hatsis is here, but that school had been overcrowded for a number of years.
Right, but it's not as though it was, the problem wasn't getting exacerbated by more kids. The problem was continuing because the same level of kids were going to be there. That's the only point, right?
Right,
Because if I'm looking at the projections now, thank you,
yeah.
right back, when did we approve this?
This board,
13.
June of 2013.
Okay, so in June of, in 10/1/2013, okay, the best available information at the time was 10/1/2012, right? 1,552 students.
Right.
At 10/1/2013, 1,512. Now, it goes up to 1,566 in 14. But today, it's at 1,511.
As I'm saying, it's been in the ballpark.
Right,
I think
so
the
the
school
kids
is
were-
sized for like
It wasn't the
1,300.
kids were coming, it was the kids were already
The kids were
there.
already there, and they were
Okay, that's
crammed in,
diff-
and it
okay.
was, yeah. So it had several points there, but it's been over capacity for some time.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Tuttle, appreciate it. Mrs. Leclerc, other questions?
I think I'm good for now.
Great, and I inadvertently cut off, Mr. Brown, I think, had some legal questions that I thought were answered, but I don't think he felt they were answered as robustly as he'd like. So if I could have bond counsel come up so we can follow up on that, thank you. And my apologies, Mr. Brown, for cutting that off last meeting.
Hi, I'm John Staffstrom from the firm of Pullman and Comley. We're bond counsel to the town.
Thank you, Mr. Sasson, for coming back again.
Happy to.
Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
That mic isn't working yet.
Yeah, it's not working all that well, is it? Thank you, Mr. Donald, for helping out there.
Okay. Let's get the water out of the way before it's up on the floor.
Thank you. You did touch on it. The original question had to do with an alternate way to take a look at these bonding resolutions, right? And the question was, what if, and Mr. Tetral kind of brought it up, what if we did, should we have taken this bonding resolution, what could we have done different? I'm interested in this whole process at this point, to ensure that what happened doesn't happen. I mean, is one answer to have turned this bonding resolution into 3 different bonding resolutions? And your answer was?
My answer was that you could have done it that way. I think, again, if you look at this, if you're asking for our experience, for example, in dealing with some of our other municipal clients, and as you know, we have many, okay? I mean, this was a sort of a unique situation in that you almost really funded this based on a feasibility study. There weren't specific drawings, as specific as you would see in other places, okay? There wasn't a specific fixed price contract. I think you also had three pieces of this project that were not necessarily integrated. So, for example, when you bond for an entire high school and give that money, or an entire school and give that to a building committee, they know they got $30 million to work with, and they work within that. Here, you have 3 separate projects which each really sort of needed to be looked at separately. So I think that if you as the Board of Finance wanted to keep better control over this process, what you probably would have done is you would have split this into 3 projects, and you probably, and maybe would have wanted insisted on a little bit more definitive estimates, definitive drawings, definitive idea of what this was going to cost. Now, I know there was some attempt to do that. I acknowledge that, because obviously there was obviously the study was attached as an exhibit to the bond resolution, which, by the way, is very unusual. Okay, and I frankly don't recall the background and the reason for doing that. But I think if you had split this into 3 pieces and sort of had a exact cost estimate on each of the 3 pieces, you would have kept better control over the cost of the project.
Okay. So what we received with this bonding resolution was this original document. It kind of broke out, it wasn't to us per phase, but it broke out the project into 3 separate areas, right? There was the kitchen and the classrooms, there was lockers, there was cafeteria, then there was the windows, and then there was the roof. So that's what we think we're getting.
Correct.
Somewhere along the line, fairly early, I guess a year into it, it's realized that this isn't going to happen, right? That we're not going to be able to do the windows under this current bonding resolution. So at that point, what should happen? The building committee went to the Board of Selectmen 5 times. There were some emails, but that's it. And the decision was made just to continue with the project and come back later when they had more information about the windows. So my question, sorry? Pricing, right. The information with pricing about the windows. My question is that okay? Or, like Penfield, really, they came up before us and said, we're not going to be able to do it under this current bonding resolution. We need additional funds, and then we all voted on that. And we agreed to go through with it. That did not happen here. And then I look at all the change orders throughout all the minutes, and we're talking about, various change orders. Some $10,000, others are $45,000. But we have the money because we're not going to do the windows. So the whole thing kind of unraveled, I think, because really there's an additional $4 million. And we're only going to do 2 projects. So how do we prevent that? And is it okay for, and I'm not talking about just this committee, I mean any committee, just to kind of take on a life of its own and make decisions that don't come before all the town bodies to relook at this whole project? Because maybe we would have put a stop to some areas of the cafeteria. Maybe we would have made some changes. I don't know. That's my question.
Well, I think you have a unique situation here, and we as council, obviously, we're not privy to some of the discussions that went on the Board of Selectmen and the Building Committee, but it seems, from what I have heard at these sessions, that there were some deadlines that needed to be met. There was clearly moving cost estimates and actually real cost about the project. For some reason, there was a discussion made to change the architect on the project at some point. So if you're asking the question, should the board have been involved in some of those discussions, it would seem to me, that people should be apprised of what's going on if the project is not going to come in within its cost. And I gather there was some information that was provided to the Board of Finance.
With fairness, the first selectman reached out a couple of times and informed me of the information, and that was all very well shared with the Board of Finance. So your point about there being apprised. Now, the Building Committee never reached out directly, okay? They were working through the Board of Finance, or through the Board of Selectmen.
I guess that really is your process, that they should work through the Board of
Understood.
Selectmen. Correct. 'Cause, they actually, technically, I guess, work for or under the direction of the Board of Selectmen,
Correct.
not this board.
Correct. Correct.
Were we advised it was $4 million over?
Not until,
I mean, when we were being told, what were, I'm trying to think of what those were. What kind of communications? Did we talk numbers? Did we have numbers of what we were over?
no, that was part of their problem.
Were they
they
being
did-
told we were significantly over?
Yes. We were told that the bids were significantly over. We were told that They were delaying on the windows for a lot of reasons, including EPA, as well as that they did not have hard costs, so they did not know what they were asking. I mean, this is all very truthful, very, very accurate in terms of what Mr. Tetro had said earlier about the numbers not being available, so them not being able to know what they were asking for, but that the project was going significantly over. There was also the discussion about the roofs and the fact that the roof, that was all disclosed and disseminated across the boards.
Okay. But
So the real question, I think one of the real questions you're getting at is, did the building committee have to build this project exactly in accordance with the specs that are attached, okay? Because one of the issues I heard discussed at the last meeting is we got a two-level cafeteria instead of a one-level cafeteria, and we got the bump out, and we got this, and we got the other thing, and we didn't necessarily anticipate that. So I can't, I can tell you that it's really not the Board of Finance's purview to decide how I mean, exactly what the project looks like. That's why you have a building committee. And I can say that's what indicative of part of the problem here is that you really were financing this on, I mean, you finance many other projects, and they're usually financed on something much more concrete than what this was financed on. And I think that is part of the problem.
I got a question there.
I don't think that's accurate.
Okay.
In fact, this was an effort to try to get things more concrete.
Well,
Because
it was portrayed that way.
Correct, exactly.
Whether it was backed up with data or not, I guess remains to be seen.
Obviously not.
I want to get a better feel for what a building committee can do and not do when they have a bond, when we have a bonding resolution, okay? That's, and maybe we need to take a look at this whole process again. If the last one was in 2007 or 8, I don't know. Mr. Tetro talked about some changes and with the town hiring an owner's rep, the architect, maybe having a liaison. I think at this point, everything needs to be looked at to make sure, as much as possible, that we don't have a situation where we're sitting here looking for $4 million when, in the end, we don't really have much of a choice but to do this, right? We have these windows that have to be replaced.
Well, in this case, you are in a unique situation also, because the last part of the project that's left is windows with an environmental issue that you probably are not going to have much choice but to address.
Correct.
Clearly, if the building committee had done the windows the first part of the project, and you were coming back to you for additional money for the cafeteria, then you'd be able to.
We would change the
Different
cafeteria,
discussion.
I could tell you that. We wouldn't be, we would say no to these change orders that went through.
Right.
All right, thank you.
I mean, and
I want to go to Mr. DeWitt, because he was up first. And then
I have a new question now. Who specified the order? Why weren't the windows done first?
Oh, you don't ask me that.
I know, I'm asking the building committee.
It was a timeline issue. All three, we broke it into 3 phases, 3 projects. So all 3 were started at the same time. Matter of fact, the environmental consultant was hired at the same time as the rest of the team to begin the process, going back and forth with the required testing, getting that prepared to send to EPA. EPA came back to us. I think at the end of the day, what was expected to be a 4 to 6 month process, 6 to 8 months, one of those, I can't remember which one, ended up being a 14-month process before we got EPA approval. So we did not know exactly what that number was going to be until January of this year when we got bids back.
Okay.
Can I follow up on one thing on that?
Yeah, then I'll get to my real points. Thanks.
okay,
Yeah.
go
No,
right
go
ahead,
ahead.
then.
Go ahead if you want to talk about the windows. Cause
No, I don't.
The sequence.
It's, Mr. Donnelly, you said something, that the timeline in the sequence, and it's something that's, quite frankly, this bothers me now, and it's new information,
Yeah.
right? When Mr. Tetro was informing me that, of the concerns that the building committee was having, right? And the fact, Mr. Tetro, you recall the conversations, a lot of what you were saying is, hey, I want to keep you guys apprised, but this thing needs to move because we need to get the work done, correct? Because the kids are coming. Now I'm hearing the kids were already there, because the numbers haven't changed that much. So there's all this thing about fast-tracking this and getting this done by September because the kids are coming. Kids were already there. We were already dealing with it. Wasn't an ideal situation, right? It wasn't optimum for delivering the program. But quite frankly, in the conversations that we were having, my understanding was there was this bubble coming through. And oh my God, we got to get this done because there's no place to put the kids. Well, guess what? We were already putting the kids. So in actuality, the whole thing about we got to get this done by this timeline to get this all set. No. Kids were already there. We were already dealing with it. We could have actually gone through the process and looked at this, is what I'm seeing when I just look at
That's what I'm feeling,
the
too.
enrollment numbers, right? Where I thought it was something completely different, and that was the urgency to get this done, and that's what the fast track was, and that's why we couldn't wait for the rest of it, right? And we had to move along. It's 1,500, it's still 1,500.
So, and perhaps I'm speaking a bit out of turn, but that was the guidance we were given. There was also a new high school schedule
I
coming
believe that.
through.
Well, the new high school schedule, funny enough, okay, and you were part of these discussions, Mr. Donlin, I understand that. This board actually pushed for that new high school, that new lunch schedule. And we actually, I don't want to say we made it contingent upon, we don't have the power to do that. But we had a lot of discussions when we were approving the new cafeteria of rectifying the situation with the schedule. Mr. Dwyer will remember, and he was very good to work with, and went back to his board and got a sense of the body that they would actually deal with the scheduling issue and make sure that everybody got lunch. But that, actually, this board was one of the people that pushed changing that, or one of the organizations that pushed changing that high school schedule in order to do the cafeteria. But I was always told there's a lot of kids coming. There's this big bubble that we have to support. They were already there. I got to go to Mr. Beck, to Mr. DeWitt.
Only because it's your last night.
Thank you so much. No, and what you're saying is accurate, I mean, but did we ever, I never remember questioning their numbers. Did we ever get a number that, kids are coming, but did they say, well, it's going to be 1,620 kids? I don't remember a chart.
I don't remember, but there was a bubble
Yeah,
coming
no, I
through. There
remember,
was a
I know,
growth.
I remember, but we
Right.
were never.
Right,
So,
and
what I'm saying is, we could have been at fault too by not questioning a little bit deeper.
Someone
And sa-
says the kids are coming.
Well, saying how many?
I think we had those discussions.
I don't
There
think,
were projections,
There
like
were
200
projections.
more or something.
oh, were there?
Yeah.
Every year there's projections.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
projections were wrong too then, okay.
Sounds like we have a general estimating problem. Go ahead, Mr. DeWitt.
So-
Thank you, Mr.
so,
Stone.
Three quick things. The first one, a little bit of a separate issue, but it did come up tonight, about bond resolutions. So I very much appreciate your conversation about what we could have done better. It feels like to me that these should have been 3 bonds and they should have been a little more detailed. But Mrs. Leclerc especially, and I know I brought it up a couple times, during bond resolution discussions, have wanted to add more information and been told, well, we need to genericize that a little bit, make it less specific. So I'm hearing from you more specific, which I tend to agree with, and we're often told less specific. So I guess no need to take that too much further, but I agree with Mr. Brown that we need to talk about the process because this, bond resolutions really, every time we talk about them, they got a different flavor to them. Years ago, I said, every time we talk bond resolution, you should be in the room. And that's not always the case. We can leave it at that. 2, this building committee, as opposed to the Penfield Building Committee, I don't know if it's a fair comparison or not. It's the last 2 that we've dealt with in long, prolonged discussions. I really feel like the building committees have it in their power to make us as aware, just us, make us as aware or unaware as they like. Penfield really made us aware. I mean, to the point where they were here for almost everything. Now, they had to make the Board of Selectmen aware because that's their charter, right? But I feel like we had a lot more communication, and even though that was a cumbersome process and there was FEMA involved, me personally, I felt like with all those ups and downs, I still always felt like I knew what the next step was. This kind of feels like, you know, I didn't know about it. And I do agree with the chairman that we were made aware of changes, but they still felt a little kind of, you know, surprising to me. The third, and I think the thing that bothers me the most is the change in the building specs. Years ago, we had approved a couple different projects without looking at the building specs. And we sat in meetings just like this with overruns, and it was the building specs called this out. And we made a concerted effort as this body to say, we want to see the building specs, and Board of Ed, make sure that we're not hiding, like was hidden in what? Desks and computers and stuff like that. So when the building specs were sacrificed, if you will, because of a financial obligation or overrun, I think that definitely should have been something that came to us. Because the building specs could be one of the real variables that drive cost. So that's really one part that I think should have come up, at least to this body, to a financial body during this process. So I don't know exactly what happened. I know the one layer, which I didn't completely understand until Mr. Tetro explained it today, how one layer plies went to two layer ply, or two layer plies went to one layer plies with the solar panels. I get it. We've had so many problems with warranties and layers and roofs for the last 10 years that I've been on the board that it didn't feel right how those building specs were manipulated. So that's my last comment, is that I really feel that even though it's a Board of Ed controlled document, it does have financial implications, and those things should be brought up to the Board of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. We're going to go to Mr. Becker, who's been patient, and I appreciate your patience, Mr. Becker.
Thank you. So this one's for bond counsel, and I guess in part kind of I'll ask a question to the board. But in the past, I've brought up a suggestion, not about these projects, because these larger projects that are run by the building committees, I've always kind of felt that they would come to us and that we'd have these types of discussions throughout the process if there was a problem, similar to a Penfield as an example. And I've suggested that maybe at our quarterly, or maybe one or two throughout the year, that all those smaller capital improvement projects that we do, that we get more of an update. And it started to trickle in a little bit better than it was in the past. But it always troubles me that we dive into the budget at every one of the quarterlies, and we spend so much time and we look at all these accounts and all these smaller dollar amounts, yet the big stuff, and I think that was my point in my comments at our last meeting, these big ones just sort of get by and a lot of times end up coming back, and then they get, one fell swoop will approve millions of dollars, and it troubles me. So what is, on your end, on the question side, we'll start off, what exactly are we able to do? Can we put something into the resolution that says because we don't control them, right? We're not the Board of Selectmen, so we don't. But where's our latitude in that on our end to say, let's protect ourselves, that we must be notified if something is off by this amount, or they must show up once every quarter, and if they're here for 5 minutes and they walk out and they say everything's great, fine. But we do it for everybody else. We're not doing it for the big stuff. And I mean this on the building committee ones, and I guess to some extent, maybe the smaller capital improvement ones. I think we've got a little better handle on that sort of a thing. But do we have something that we can put in, or does it just
I would suggest, and I'm sure you've been told this before, that probably is not the bond resolution is probably not the appropriate place to put that. The bond resolution, the investors rely on the bond resolution as authorizing the project, and opinion letters are giving on it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there can't be a protocol developed by this board in conjunction with the Board of Selectmen as to what should happen with a building committee. There are there are other clients of ours where the building committees give monthly reports, quarterly reports, and I'm sure that they're giving regular reports to the Board of Selectmen because they work to the Board of Selectmen. That doesn't mean that other bodies in town can't be copied on those, and so that the information is
And in several building committees, we are.
is readily available. So I think my sense of your frustration here is there's a reporting. I mean, there may be a substantive issue, but the first issue you have here is a procedural issue, because until you go through the procedural piece of this, then you don't know what the substantive problem is. But I would suggest to you the place is not to put that in the bond resolution itself,
Right.
But in other protocols that are followed.
So I would say perhaps Capital Summit in September, because at this point we're almost onto the summer and all of that, but perhaps it's a place to talk about, because I would think the RTM, because they're going to be the next one with the string of questions, right, the 3 boards, but perhaps come up with something on that end, and if it's got to be agreed upon, then great. I mean, it sounds to me, is the Board of Selectmen part, that's a state statute, or is that something in our charter? Like, is that something that we can change to say that
the building committee reports to, I
Yeah,
think is what you're
but to
asking.
protect ourselves as a board, like, can we
You'd
put
probably have
forward-
to get your interpretation from the town attorney and not me, but my sense is, because of the way the town is structured, it's a charter issue.
Okay. So that would maybe be something. I know that charter reform is thrown out there, but we're certainly,
spend, at 50% spend, you got a report, or
That's-
70% spend?
that's what I'm thinking. Some sort of a trigger like what we do
Yeah,
with everything
I like
else.
percentage of spend.
So, yeah.
Okay. Mrs.
Before we
LaFleur.
move on from that issue, I'd like to address that exact same question that David was just on. So, it is a statutory and it's a charter issue. So there's nothing we can do, and this board can't control any of that with the building committee. So until that change is done, the only aspect that we can do to control that really is the bond resolution, correct?
No, I would suggest that if you're really that concerned about that.
Oh, we're concerned.
If you're that concerned about that, you could certainly go to the Board of Selectmen and the RTM, who have the authority to pass an ordinance, and suggest there needs to be an ordinance that outlines the protocol for building committees.
And
I mean,
until
that would-
then, we don't approve anything? Is that what you're saying we should do?
Well, I'm not saying you don't approve anything. You
Oh,
obviously
don't approve any
you
building
approve
projects.
everything.
Don't approve any building projects until we were comfortable with that.
I think you clearly, we're sensing the board clearly needs to be comfortable with that. All I'm suggesting is that to put conditional language in a bond resolution would not be appropriate vis-à-vis investors and opinion letters and other things that need to be given. But I do think that if you're concerned that a protocol is not enough, I mean, there's always the option to put this in ordinance. It doesn't necessarily require a charter amendment. You can't take away the authority of the Board of Selectmen to appoint the building committee.
Yeah.
But there's lots and lots of cities and towns that have ordinances that govern the protocols for reporting, which is really, again, I understand you have a substantive issue, so I'm not just saying it's a reporting issue, but the first part of this is a reporting issue.
Yes.
Is what I'm understanding.
Thank you. I want to go back to Mrs. Leclerc, who was cut off, so go right ahead.
Well, it's about the bond resolution, and so it kind of follows in with what Jim Walsh was saying. Because going back years in time, we had similar issues, that things that we wanted done weren't being done, and so we put them in our motions, and because it wasn't in the exact bond resolution, it still didn't happen the way we thought it was going to happen. So someone had suggested that whatever material you were presented with, you should attach that to your bond resolution, which we've been trying to do religiously since then, is to attach it so there's no question what our intent was to spend the funds on and what budget we were provided. And so that is exactly what we did with this bond resolution. We attached this conceptual study to the bond resolution with the intent that that's how the funds would be spent, knowing that there was wiggle room between different items. But the intent was there, that there were the roof, the windows, and the additions to be money to be spent on. So I'm still struggling with how that doesn't need to be followed, because those were material amounts. I can understand if it's like immaterial, small adjustments, there's a contingency, and things change. But when there's three main phases, and we attach something like that, I'm still struggling with why doesn't that need to be followed?
Well, you had the three main phases here, because frankly, if the building committee had been able to stay within the budget, we wouldn't be having any discussion about whether we're having a bumped out two-tier cafeteria or not, because
Right.
they would have stayed within the budget. I think that my understanding is the exigencies of this situation, given the timing, and the fact that it was a conceptual study without much more hard bid numbers, because it certainly is unusual. It is unusual for a project to go this far over budget. It's significantly over budget. It's not 5% or 10% or 15%, which you sometimes get in these type of things. And I think it's based, again, you know, I think that, Mr. Leclerc, you said it right, it's the conceptual nature of this, at least in looking at it from hindsight now, in my view, and having read the minutes and having read the back and forth between the Board of Selectmen and the Building Committee, that was part of the problem. I mean, but I clearly understand the Board of Finance thought they were getting 3 phases funded in this, and what they ended up with 2 phases.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's go to Mr. Walsh. I think you had something?
Yes. You said we were presented with a feasibility study. That was your term, and we never saw it that way. We were never told, we were not sold this on a feasibility study. We paid good hard money of taxpayers' dollars, hired an architect who had done great work in this town, actually. I think he was the architect on Stratfield. Done a phenomenal job there. Project came out great, on budget. We were never told that this was a feasibility study.
I might have used the wrong term, conceptual study.
We were sold that this was going to be the cost of the project. So it's, and as part of that project, the windows were definitely a part of the project, because they'd gone back 10 years before that, if not more. So it wasn't, to me, when I was voting on this, a feasibility study at all. It was what the project was going to be. And this building committee had a duty, no matter what, to bring it in or to come back to us for that. It wasn't about just reporting. It was about, it was reporting, but it was if more money was needed at that time, when they knew they couldn't do this project, which to me in some of these minutes seems to go back to 2014. 2013, I'm sorry, you're right. We should have had, they should have come back. So I'm a little, I'm just disappointed it's too low, too minimal a word, that we're here now and that these are the numbers. In regards to our role on the Board of Finance, I understand that we can't pick like what window style goes in, that's all their purview. But what I don't get is that one whole portion of this project, the windows, is not being done, and we knew about it, that there was definitely not going to be any money. To me, the Board of Ed made a decision when it got presented this. They made the windows optional. That was their purview. They voted on it. They're the ones who made it optional. So to me, this project's what it is, with the money that it is. If they want to present a building, a Windows project, we'll vote on a Windows project. Because there wasn't enough money. And they made it optional. Am I missing something with that, under the bond?
Again, as I said at the last meeting, they clearly, what they spent the money on was clearly within the resolution. They just didn't, there just wasn't enough to finish the project, okay? and I understand part of the other frustration, if they were here saying we ran out of money and there was an optional part of the project to be done, you could be saying yes or you could be saying no. You have a part of the project now that probably does need to be done to satisfy the environmental issues and everything else related, so that's where your real frustration comes in. I mean, it's one of the sources of frustration.
It's one of the sources of frustration. It's like when it was known that we could not do this project for the money that we had, other people made decisions about what they prioritized. Some other frustrations are, how many people had input basically into this process, and basically because they wanted certain things, the project kept escalating. The architect knew how much money they had to work with. They're making this two-level butterflied cafeteria. Certain points in the thing, they're talking about having it be a cafe. Seems to be some talk about certain types of kiosks and tables and size of tables and things like this. All we were talking about and were sold was a bump out in the cafeteria. There's also much talk about, wanting to have this other private little area to meet, like a meeting area. That was never in the ed specs. Did you see that in the ed specs? This little meeting area?
Those are his questions, I think.
I didn't see that in the ed spec. Sure. Yeah, I'd like a response.
Okay, so I think to that point, the cafeteria is a multi-use area. And if that's what you're asking, were we designing, or did we ask the architect to design something so we could have different meeting areas? No. Is the utility of it practical for that purpose? Yes. Does the town use it? Yes.
But we were talking about a simple, bump out. And to get to Dr. Title's point in regards to some of the questions Mr. Flynn asked him about the number of students, he even admitted right now there's probably not possibly enough space there now, but maybe not. And decisions were made to cut down on that square footage space by the building committee, by doing this, and by the architect. By doing the bi-level, you cut into the usable square footage of that space. By having that ramp there, when it all could have been on the same level and that ramp space be used as more square footage. How much square footage does the ramp take up?
I didn't calculate it.
Hundreds of square feet?
If it's 3 foot wide by 25, 30 feet long, that would be about 90 square feet.
Okay.
By my calculations.
It just seems as though decisions were made that cost money, and I think the last time we were here, you had mentioned that based on some quick calculations, actually it wasn't by you, I think it was, I don't know if it was by the construction manager, that in regards to the overrun, approximately $1.18 million when the overrun was caused in the cafeteria alone. Is that correct?
That's what Mr. Manning said. I think we have to get to the root of some of this. That's 1.18 over the conceptual design. That did not include any escalation, was missing some of those costs that Mr. Tetro alluded to earlier. So yes, was it probably at the end of the day over? But we're missing some information that we didn't have because the simple bump out, as you call it, was left at that point. And part of the thing that we discussed at the last meeting as well was, based on the timeline and the guidance we received, to go back to design documents or schematic documents to do that bump out. We're now losing time in order to get to the construction.
Why was the bump out causing a further delay in time?
Well, the architect would have to redesign it if it's simple, because you would have to go from concept to schematic to design documents.
So it was the decision by the committee to do this bi-level cafeteria system, even though you had stated at the last meeting that you knew it was going to cost more. And you guys still decided, even when you did your value engineering, you knew you could have saved money in that area, but you decided to go forward anyway.
This was at the design phase.
At the design phase?
Yes, where we found out that it was going to cost more, and we value engineered. We rejected a further value engineering to further reduce it. We rejected the value engineering to take it out altogether because of the concerns of spacing. So we reduced it as much as we thought, and were given guidance that it would still meet the needs of the school.
Okay, but it was more expensive. And like, I'm looking at one of your minutes from one of your meetings on February 12, 2014, wherein there's an architect's presentation, and it doesn't exactly say who said it, but there's a bullet point that says, it is important that the committee look at the ed specs regarding the project. If an aspect isn't affordable, it can't be done. To me, that was a luxury we just didn't have, and blew through money and space, to be quite honest with you, that we just didn't have. And when the value engineering was being done, I think that should have been something that should have been put on the table and brought back to what we were sold, which was, when we were sold this, we had hired an architect who just said it was going to be a simple blow-up, a bump out of the cafeteria. And it wasn't. It became much more than that. Especially if the space, if space in the cafeteria was an issue, which Dr. Title said it was, it just makes no sense to go with a design that reduces the square footage because of a bi-level design, that I had to include a ramp. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a ramp. I'm saying that everything we have at that school should be handicapped accessible. There was just a single level design that would have been completely accessible, and would have been more accessible to me than making handicapped people have to go up and down a ramp when the original design was a one level cafeteria. And that's all I have for right now.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Anybody else? Mrs. Claire?
Well, questions for bond counsel. So we have an amendment to the resolution that we originally passed, but now the Board of Ed has changed their ed specs to not include the windows. Are there currently ed specs that that they'll follow on this new revised?
I don't think that's a
Motion?
question for me. I think that's probably a question for either the building committee or the Board of Education.
Okay.
I mean, we've drafted a resolution based on the increase that people tell us is going to be sufficient to finish the project, but that's information we've received from
Okay.
other sources.
But would they have to revise their ed specs for this, or?
That's a technical question.
How-
For reimbursement, right?
I think so, right?
So Board of Ed Chairman's here, can he answer that question?
Or
Are you
Dr.
updating you updating the specs, right? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Somebody?
The question is, are there ed specs for the windows?
Right.
Period.
They were taken out of the original ones, right?
Yeah.
Do we know an answer to
So,
that?
so if, and, you know, Mr.
Well,
Mr.
that
Dwyer-
question's to the board chairman, I thought.
Okay.
I don't know.
I can answer.
No one's.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I
Go
can-
ahead,
It's-
Nancy.
answer,
It's,
so go
yeah,
ahead.
no.
Bill, can you please come
So
up to the
the-
table,
the-
please?
It's looking like he doesn't know what he's.
No.
Quite sure what the question is.
The ed specs were amended to the language of to do as much of the windows as the current budget allow.
Okay. The question is, are there ed specs for the windows?
Yeah, there were originally ed specs for the windows. The only change we made was not to the specs for the windows, but to make the statement that do as many of the windows as the budget might allow, knowing that there were budget problems.
Okay. So
But that did not change the actual specs for each window. It was more the timing of it and how much you could accomplish. Part of the rationale for keeping that in is that there were already design costs for the windows which could be captured within the state reimbursement. So if we had taken the windows completely out of that, there would have been, I'll say, sunk costs that could not be recouped.
Okay. Mr. Leclerc?
Okay, so by increasing the budget, then the windows can be done, and there's no change required to the ed specs.
With no change to the specs for the windows,
Right.
but the ed specs were changed to allow for as much of the windows as could be afforded, knowing full well that in all likelihood, once we finally heard from EPA, we're not likely to have had enough money to do all of the windows. But we didn't, as a board, our concern was to allow the other two segments of the project to move forward, and then to do as much of the windows as possible and not delay all three projects, but to have an ed spec that was adjusted to allow those portions of the project that from timing and pricing could move forward.
But what we have to approve today, the existing ed specs are sufficient to guide the building,
The answer is yes, yeah,
to cover reimbursement?
correct.
Okay.
Well, the building committee probably ought to answer, but I mean, the ed specs for the actual windows have not changed, and those would be what would guide the building committee in prosecuting that project.
I think if I can, I think Ms. LaFrere's question is the money that's being proposed sufficient to finish the windows? Is that your question?
No, it's that we need ed specs to get reimbursement, and so I want to make sure that current existing ed specs are what we need.
Mr. Walsh?
How much money is left in the budget to do the windows, as Mr. Dwyer just addressed, the Board of Ed wanted you to do?
I think off the top of my head, I think there's $270,000 left in the contingency.
And how many windows will that do?
258, 838?
That sounds right.
There's a sheet in the last PowerPoint slide shows it.
Yep. And how many windows will that take care of?
Get you started on the remediation, probably.
Just the remediation? Start?
Only started.
Yeah.
If we wanted to break this into its own project, what are the pluses and minuses of doing that? We don't approve this. We want to do it as its own project, brought back to us as its own project, to the town bodies. What are the pluses and minuses for doing that?
I think the first question you would want to ask, which I don't know the answer to, I'm sure the building committee does, is are the other two phases of the project complete within the money that's already been advanced? Because if you were going to actually, if you're going to split this into a separate project, you would need to know whether the other two phases were done and whether there was any money left from the first two phases to apply to the new project.
So is the $270,000 is left in contingency
Is the project
needed in any other areas of any of these two phases that you've done? It's not. So the 270 is completely available for only windows, because you've done everything else on the project.
Yeah, everything else is complete.
Okay.
We have design documents. The architect would have to finish up some documents as well. So we have those. Currently, we have sunk some cost, obviously, into beginning the whole process of it. My understanding, and if Mr. Morabito is here, he can speak to the technical aspects, is the disadvantage of not approving it at this point. It would, I think you have to start the EPA process again.
Okay.
And if I remember when, what he reported at a meeting, that it would then become an issue where it had a new case number, and you're starting essentially from square one.
Mr. Morabito, can you come to the table, please?
Thank you, Mr. Dwyer, I appreciate it.
Hello. Can you explain that process that he was just speaking about?
The OSF process?
Yes. Well, OSF versus EPA. There's two processes, correct?
There's a lot of processes. Office of School Facilities.
That's
I
get
was
the
looking up
reimbursement. That's to
something,
get
so-
reimbursement, correct?
That's to
Versus
get
the
reimbursement.
EPA versus the EPA, which is to approve
An abatement
the
plan,
idea and how we plan on doing the work, the remediation.
the remediation.
Yes.
The EPA, we hired a environmental consultant. Tests were done on the materials. It's an iterative process. You don't know how much testing is going to be done until you get the results of the previous testing. From that, they worked on an abatement plan, the process to fulfill the EPA requirements. Very strict EPA, anything over 50 parts per million is going to be remediated in some fashion. This went through several iterations with the EPA. They're very specific on the backup data that they want. They slice and dice it and dissect it incredibly. As Mr. Donald said, four major submissions by the environmental consultant to the EPA before we finally got approval for the remediation plan that we do have now, and that is what was bid. That information is also is required to get any bid. You can't guess at that number. You can't have a hold on that. It's specific about how much, essentially, the PCBs leach into the brickwork.
Yeah.
So you have to know how much brickwork and where to remove it. You have to know where you're going to encapsulate and how far and all that data. If you can't provide that data to a contractor, they're just going to give you a wild guess. So that's not something to budget on.
Okay, so now we know that.
Right.
Right?
Now, we have that number
That's definitive.
from the bids that were done, received in January.
But we have the amount of work and the remediation levels that need to be done that we can bid out, correct?
Correct.
Okay. My next question is, how long do we have to complete that? Is there a legal requirement that the EPA has given us for completing that remediation work? Because I know on Osborne we had 10 years, correct?
That was a different case. There's not, as far as I know, a deadline. They want you to, they understand funding process. So as long as we're pursuing the funding process, they're not pounding on the table saying, why aren't you doing this remediation? They understand you need money to do the remediation, and we're following the steps. And it might take some time.
Okay.
Nebulous. There's not a specific number.
There's no definitive time.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Just to, separate from that question, I did a little work in the environmental space. Is the testing that has been done only valid for a period of time? And if the work is not done within that period of time, you have to retest?
Not necessarily retest, but if it becomes a, again, nebulous number, becomes too long for the EPA, they might want some monitoring tests
Got it.
to see that the condition hasn't changed
Right.
in some way, shape, or form. Exactly what that would entail,
Right.
don't know until we get there.
Okay. Mr. Walsh, can I recognize Mr. Matola? Sure.
So if we waited a year and a half, 2 years, forget about the EPA process, is it a fair statement that it would cost more money to do this project if you waited a year or two?
Escalation, absolutely.
Mrs. Leclerc?
Because we've been through this a couple times now, like with Riverfield and Osborne Hill, we decided to remove everything, and even though it was a little more costly, instead of encapsulate. So you just mentioned that now. Is that part of why it took longer, because we're not actually removing everything? Is there more risk to this project?
Risk in, I'm not sure what you mean by...
As far as PCPs, by not removing...
The EPA, it was a long consultation with the EPA through the environmental consultant as to they allow encapsulation when it's practical. It was getting to the point that it would be impractical to do all removals on the windows. Basically, the removals of the masonry is, it's all exterior masonry that has the issue. They're looking at where it can possibly come into dermal contact with a student or a staff member or anybody, and that was on the first floor. That was at grade level. So they realize it's basically fiscally impossible, and practically impossible, to do all those removals 3 stories up. Actually, 4 stories in some places because the building's into a hill. So that was the allowance, and it took a while to get that allowance out of them and provide the technical data that they needed to make that decision and allow that in the abatement plan.
So we aren't removing everything on the higher levels, but we are on the lower.
We're encapsulating on the upper levels, yes.
Okay. And I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go.
Chairman, do I get my question back? Because
Yes,
it's
you
bounced
do.
around to like
That's
4 or
what I was
5
gonna do.
people in a row, so I was kind of...
That's correct.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Mr. Morbido, now tell me about, so we could bid this as long as we stay, you don't know what the nebulous time frame is for when they might say that they want further testing or whatever.
I would say, you know, by the end of the, I would say by the fall, they would be calling us and asking, what are you doing?
Okay.
And then we would be getting into the process of a temporary O&M procedure and getting that defined. And there again, Osborne taught us we had to do, between the air emergency that we had in summer of, or late school year 2011-2012, we did some emergency measures during the summer of 2012. We also had to test that building quarterly, and that costs about $10,000 on a building that's 50,000 square feet. We're talking about a building that's 300,000 square feet. So is that number proportional? I don't know. So you're talking tens of thousands of dollars to get into, potentially, yes, potentially getting into tens of thousands of dollars for this O&M that's not budgeted anywhere.
So the EPA doesn't care what the funding mechanism is, as long as we start moving towards a solution and getting the remediation performed. I mean, if we broke the funding off from this specific project and didn't approve this bond, but started its own project, they don't care either way.
For that point, no, I don't think they would care about that. It would, doing that would complicate the school reimbursement.
That's where I'm going to go next. Okay, so I just wanted to
you're
clear
going
the
there, okay.
EPA now, and then we're going to go to the OSF situation next, with the reimbursement.
Reimbursement.
Okay. And this reimbursement, we have $270,000 left, which I guess you plan on using towards the windows, correct? You want 3.9 and change million more. How much reimbursement, if we stick with this, are we expected to get, and what hurdles do we have to go through to get that money?
Right now, we had the approval to bid.
Yep.
Once the contracts are signed, once the funding is issued, assuming the funding's issued, contracts would be signed with Gilbane, and they would sign with their subcontractors and pursue the job. We would turn in for incremental payments. Basically, it would be at the end of each summer, probably in September, we would turn it in. The costs that we've incurred to date, we would get our 26-point-something% on the eligible costs of that project. On this project, the windows that are affected by PCBs are fully eligible, so you would get 26% of those costs. If you were replacing a window that was not impacted by hazardous materials, there's a different breakdown. They don't pay for the window itself, they pay for the labor to put it in and certain other things.
Is the remediation work eligible for reimbursement at 26%?
Yes.
It is, okay. So this whole project, including design costs for those windows, is eligible for 26% reimbursement?
Correct.
Okay, and out of all the windows, how much percentage of the windows have been affected by PCBs?
That's all of the windows that we're talking about.
All of them?
Yeah, I don't believe that we have any that are not impacted.
That are not impacted, okay. And if we were to break this into a separate project, it causes problems because you now have to start a new project, correct? Tell me about that process.
The process would be starting off with a new ed spec for a new project. The funding would have to be a new application to the state, which would require copies of the normal resolutions that go through the various boards. They're called the 3 resolutions that enable a building committee, allow for filing of a state grant, and the preparations of specs, plans and specs. That they're already prepared, we wouldn't be, I'm not sure that we would be able to transfer the cost for something that was encumbered under a different project number with the state. I would actually have to check with them because it's, I actually haven't run across it. A building committee would have to be enabled by the Board of Selectmen. The members would have to be approved by the Board of Selectmen and the RTM. So you have all those several months' worth of hurdles to go over just to set up the process. Then the building committee that's enabled would be coming back to this board with their numbers. By that time, all the bid numbers would be, the bid numbers are already expired, but there is good faith assurances from the building, from those subs to Gilbane that they'll hold their numbers, assuming, I'm not sure the cutoff date, but it's within the next month or two, to allow for this process right now to go through. If you're going into the fall or late into the winter, something like that, next spring, those are all done. You would have to go into a bidding process again. The bidding process on this for the for Gilbane, I believe, was in the range of $50,000. And there was money spent for the architect for assistance during bidding. So you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars that would be expended to rebid the project, besides all the steps that you just had to take to refile a
But the
new
architect's
project.
plans would probably pretty much still stay the same. The architect's plans of what type of windows, the size of the windows, that scope of work, we pretty much know what that is, right?
Well,
We
you know what that
bought
is.
We
bought that.
purchased that.
You purchased that already.
Yeah.
Not sure that because it'll be used on a different job number with the state that they would see that preparation cost as being reimbursable. I would have to talk to the folks up there to get that clue. Right now, the way that, okay, sorry.
Yeah, one other question, and I don't know the answer, you have to check this, but the legislature recently changed the reimbursement rates from many municipalities to reduce them in order to address some of the state budget issues. So I don't know if you started this as a new project, whether you would get 26, we still might, I haven't looked, we haven't looked at it. I don't know if you've looked at it, but
I have.
There have been reductions.
And it would be reduced.
What's the reduction?
Right now, I just had a conversation in the past couple of days. The reimbursement rate is based on the date of that the funding was issued. Right now, it's reduced where we were I believe we were 26.07 a year ago for, say, a bond that was done 2015, first half of 2015. Now a bond is, we would get reimbursement of 25.36%.
And that
So
was
we
done by the
lost
legislature? Man, the love keeps coming from them for this town, huh? This legislature's been great to this town.
And they're also more difficult about, on re-reviews of plans, there are hurdles to go over what they're actually seeing as allowing to be eligible. They have a lot of the tweaks to that every time we go up there.
Sure.
Follow up on what you just said. $3.9 million. We approve this now. Does it get reimbursed under the old rate or the new rate?
It would be on the old rate. What I have
Because
done,
it's an existing project?
it's an existing project. We have filed, just as a placeholder, what's called an EDO 49R, to say that there would be a revision to the funding amount. So I put a placeholder, I marked my place, and you're actually amending the bond that in this case, amending the bond that was already produced at an earlier date.
Got it.
And that number, and that date holds.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Walsh.
So it's going to be, have you calculated what the difference in reimbursement dollars would be?
I'd have to go sit down and
Okay.
work on that for you.
So it's about 1%
You're
on
lo-
3.94 million bucks.
And right there, of the $3.9 million, there's a large portion of that, I don't want to say a large portion, a portion of that 500 and, I don't have all the numbers in front of me, 540,000 is contingency, 15.
Okay.
So right off the bat, that's not expected to be spent, so you're looking at, say, 3.3 million. So it's that 25% of the 26% of the 3.3 million.
Which there seems to be a change by the legislature of 1 percentage point to this town, so it'd be about 1% of the 3.3,
Correct.
which would be, what's that,
300,000.
33,000?
No, it would be 30,000.
30,000.
It'd be about $33,000.
I thought you said it was 300, I thought you said it was $3.3 million, the project reimbursable
3.3
amount.
million.
Yeah, times 1%,
That 1% of that would be,
33,000.
move the decimal, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
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 Okay. My other question, I guess, is if we approve this amount, I guess that's going to affect your projects going forward. Because obviously, if we're adding $4 million onto our waterfall for your projects, clearly, other projects are either going to have to get bumped
I would defer the reply to that to the chairman
to the chairman of
of the board,
Okay. Well,
Mr. Dwyer, to make that statement. It's not appropriate for me to
Well,
make. But we understand.
you understand. Or to cut other things such as, I guess we could just do, take their non-recurring number and not fund that for 2 years. That would cover it as well.
Sure.
So, okay.
Do you want to comment on that? Yeah, please. Either one?
It's a policy decision, so I'll come forward. We update our capital plan in anticipation of the fact that the windows would cost more. We had already made adjustments to accommodate the fact that some projects would either have to be delayed or changed in some fashion so that we would continue to do what we have always promised, and that is that to work with the town as a single town and make sure that we stay under that 10% goal for all town projects and school board projects. We remain committed to doing that.
And you've already updated that?
And our capital plan had been updated to allow for that. With a placeholder number, before, of course, the bids were actually received, but any minor differences that might occur between the actual bid and final cost versus what we might have in as the placeholder, we would just continually, this is a document that's dynamic. It gets adjusted frequently.
Well, I mean, I guess, do you recall what that change was? What got bumped to later on because of this? If we approve this, what's going to get bumped to later on?
There are multiple projects, and they get bumped from one year to the other, and sometimes they get moved up a year because what we had hoped could be done 2 years from now suddenly now has to be done next year. So it's not, I don't think you could look and say, because of this windows, it was this project that got moved. There were multiple projects that get moved around to make the balance work.
Okay. That's all I have for right now.
Let me check my lifeline here. Is that a reasonable statement? That's correct. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dwyer.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Anybody else? Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Well,
regarding this item? Anything at all?
I just spoke for a while. If anybody else has anything, they're welcome to go, but I do have a couple of other questions.
Go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
Mr. Donald, you stated last time, because it was disturbing to me that the architect that originally we spent a fair amount of money on doing the original conceptual plans didn't get invited back to be one of the four. And when we questioned you the last time, you said that there was one board member that had made comments that they thought it was unfair that company would get a chance to come back. What board member was that?
So, first, I completely misspoke in that regard. So, there was an offer on the table prior to any architects being reviewed from the gentleman at Silver Petroselli to come and explain the documents to us. And that offer was declined by the board after quite a bit of discussion for fear that perhaps he would gain some undue influence over being selected as an architect.
When was that, what board meeting was that discussing? Because I read through your minutes, and there's not one sentence in your minutes about that extensive conversation you just mentioned.
The debate was centered, I'm trying to recall specifically which one was which, but there was extensive debate over whether or not to select him as part of the 4 that were invited to present. And I recall him, excuse me, I keep saying him, Silver Petroselli was one of the top 6, and I don't remember why specifically he wasn't selected to present, but I know there was a lot of debate about that. I know, and again, this is a hindsight issue, that when there was a mention of him presenting, and I don't quite frankly recall that piece of it.
You don't recall?
No.
Okay. No, it's just interesting because when reading your minutes, Ms. Ortel makes a representation that she's held positions at Perkins, Eastman, and Antonazzi. And to those 2 companies end up on the final list. Was she the one who was raising an issue about it?
No.
Okay. The process seems definitely flawed that if we're spending money on an architect and having new documents, that they don't at least come to be one of the final 4. Something's flawed with that system. And I think we need to get to a whole new system in regards to how we do building committees and how this board gets updated on that. And based on that, I'm going to make a motion that this board should form a committee on what we expect out of building committees, what level of detail, what their procedures are, and make a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen in regards to that, because they're the ones who have the both the charter and statutory responsibility in regards to building committees. Because the only way that it's going to happen is if that doesn't happen, I guess I can't go and vote on another building project after seeing the way this just happened. And this type of committee is not unheard of. Mr. Tetro and I served on a similar committee when we had problems with the state reimbursement process. It was an RTM committee. And we had extensive meetings on it. We came out with some fairly good recommendations that to this day we're still following, and we haven't had a reimbursement problem since then. And I think at this point in time, I think this board's got to form a committee to get to figure out how we want and what our recommendations as our board going forward are going to be.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. We'll come back to that item after we finish this one. Sure. And we'll go forward. Does anybody else have a question, comment, or concern on this? Seeing none, I'm going to briefly go to the public for any comments on this item, and then I'll bring it back to the board for a vote. Nothing from the public on this? Please, feel free. Good evening. Hi. Please name, address, you know the...
Hi, my name is Drew Georgiadis, 321 Puritan Road. I have been a taxpayer in Fairfield for 25 years. I am currently on the RTM District 9. My 4 boys went through Sherman, through Tomlinson, through Fairfield Ludlow High School. My last kids graduated last year in 2015. So I would like to recommend that this window project remains in the current project as one, and that you approve it. And what I'm going to follow right now, we have been talking, obviously, you're a Board of Finance, and you think about the finance element, but I would like to talk about the human element of some of these delays and decisions that are made. My boys, when they were in Sherman, we went through asbestos tiles being removed, delay of school. We went through toxic mold carpet removed, delay of school. They went to school in portables that had leaky roofs. One had a skunk underneath it. And as a parent, yes, I got involved. We managed to get annexes at Sherman School, but again, after my kids had gone. So my kids did not benefit from that. But we look at this town as a whole. I love Fairfield. I'm very happy with the educational experience my kids have had. But again, we move forward. My kids went through Tomlinson. They move into Ludlow. My son's 504 plan was lost for 2 years, which was then found. But again, you're patient. You overlook some of these things because you like to believe that the town boards have the kids, the human interest, top of mind. My son, his teacher was arrested, and he didn't have a teacher for a while in an AP class that definitely affected him. 2 of my other children had the physics teacher, which was 5 physics teachers through the end of the year, to the point where they couldn't finish their curriculum and they chose not to take the AP class. So all through that, I was a patient parent, I was a patient taxpayer, okay? They all have been in those classrooms that are 90 degrees because those windows are uninsulated at the very least, beyond the PCBs. Those rooms are like furnaces, okay? They are not good learning facilities. And 3 out of my 4 boys, because they took AP and honors classes, ate in their classrooms. So you talk about the cafeteria, but the fact that my kids, 3 out of 4 of my kids, ate in their classrooms, provided this town with a little bit of cushion for the size of the classroom over those years before the schedule was changed. Now, my kids left before the schedule was changed this fall. But again, I would like you very much to take into consideration, I know your mind, your finance minds, we're very lucky to have you volunteer. We're very lucky. I'd like to thank everyone who serves on building committees, which last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But again, roll a little bit of the human element and these students and what they're going through. Okay, as a taxpayer, I'm patient, but the students, it's very important for them to have the best learning facility. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public?
Suzanne Miska, 123 Rygate Road. The process is flawed. It was flawed when it was presented to you. Attached to that was an AMC report describing PCBs, how we could not have put our hands around what we were going to be dealing with in the timeline. I don't understand. I mean, I appreciate I came from a corporate background and we dot our I's and cross our T's, but a lot of this was portrayed that we were all set to go, we were ready to go, we knew what the process was. That said, I do appreciate what's been built. I do appreciate the new high school schedule, even though I was, and I will come forward, a big skeptic of it. In my opinion, however, I would have rather seen a library to meet the kids' needs than the cafeteria. I don't really appreciate the need for a lunch period. These kids all have to make choices, but that's another story. These windows have been an issue since some of you were on the Board of Ed. We have been talking about these windows. I was very upset and frustrated to hear that the Board of Ed was willing to move these as an optional piece in order to meet the timeline. I also was extremely upset that we went with a single-ply roof at a school that had already experienced a roof flying off. And while I appreciate the solar panels, every other roofing project in this town, whether at elementary or middle school, has a 2-ply roof with solar panels. So let us hope that that single-ply roof and all those solar panels keep the water back. My problem is this. In 2014, it was made known that this project was going to be over budget. At that point, I don't understand how you're allowed to go out to bid knowing that you don't have the funds to meet the allocation, whether those windows were estimated at $3 million or $3.5 million or $4 million. I also don't understand why the bond is at $3.9 million when the motion, according to the minutes of the building committee, is to request $3.5 million. and you have $270,000 still sitting in the budget, and you're asking for $3.9 million. So I'm a little confused what number we're really asking for to meet the demand. The process is flawed. We fast-tracked it. You're now working on Holland Hill with a new process that has been granted $250,000. In the last Board of Ed meeting, we had to go over whether or not those portables had toilets or didn't have toilets and what was costed, and nobody seems to know. We're going down the same road again. This needs to be addressed. I suggest strongly the Board of Finance send a liaison to the building committee. This has to be stopped. There has to be a better way of doing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Miska, M-I-S-K-A, Suzanne, S-U-Z-A-N-N-E.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Mrs. Miska. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Please.
Christine Vitale, 254 Vernon Hill Road. I have 3 children in the school district. My oldest just graduated from Ludlow last year. I spent a good portion of that time waiting for this project to go into fruition. I'm very happy that the cafeteria was put in because I now have a freshman, and she is enjoying having lunch. My older daughter did not have a lunch period for 3 years that she was there, and looking back, I wish that she did. She was in classes where teachers were scurrying from one room to the other because there wasn't enough classroom space. So I appreciate the investment that this town has put into the renovation as it stands right now. I'm concerned about delaying the windows any further, aside from the PCBs. The heat in those classrooms is a real issue. It was 90 degrees yesterday. My daughter, who has asthma, came home having an asthma attack, pretty much because she was sitting in classrooms that were probably at least 80 degrees. I appreciate the due diligence that you've gone through these last couple meetings. I appreciate the work of the building committee. I was the PTA president last year, so I have been reviewing the minutes. I do have an appreciation of some of the challenges that the committee faced, and I'm a little frustrated that this, committee, not the committee, that the windows really could have been put in this summer if they had been approved by the Board of Selectmen and by this board earlier in the year. So now we're already losing a year, and now we're talking about delaying further, and I'm just concerned about the kids and the teachers that go to school there every day. So I'm going to ask you to please, explore the building committees further if you need to, but please vote tonight to amend this bond resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Spell your last name for me.
V-I-T-A-L.
All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns from the public? Seeing none, I'm going to come back to the board. Any questions, comments before we vote?
Well, I don't think this board held anything up in regards to the project getting done this summer or not, so I just want that fact out on the table. I don't think this board did one thing before this thing got before us to delay this project that it could have been done over the summer or not been done during the summer. There is no evidence of that at all, and if there is, I'd like to hear it.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh? This is Mrs. Leclerc.
Yeah, I just want to make sure the public understands that in 2013, we thought we approved the windows, and we thought that project was going to be done. So, and this is the first time it's coming back to us for any kind of approvals. So we take no responsibility for what happened. We have approved everything that has come our way. We're just trying to figure out why it changed and why it's not coming before us until now.
Thank you, Mrs. Leclerc. Before we vote, I'll be approving this resolution because I think the windows need to be done. And in fact, 10 years ago, I thought the windows at that school needed to be done. It waited in line, got reprioritized, reshuffled several times, and to Mrs. Leclerc's point, got approved several years ago to be done with all due speed. I don't think it's ever been a question of this board approving the investment in schools, particularly in this specific item. I think what the question is, and the concern is that we've had multiple projects now go way over budget. This one probably the most severe in my memory. And to come upon us as well as the Board of Selectmen, as well as the RTM, to make sure that the taxpayers' money is spent wisely and that, quite frankly, we get what we paid for. The frustration that I have is, when we originally put this process in place, and Dr. Todd will remind me, I think it's the same process we used for Osborne Hill, correct? In terms of picking the architect or recommending the architect and doing that. That project has gone pretty smoothly, with the exception of that one walkway, correct? In this instance, we might have had a confluence of events where we had the building committee come back and explore other options with architects and go in a different direction, which is perfectly within their purview. We've also had all these expenses and the EPA and everything else come in. What do we learn from that? Was that when we did the conceptual ed specs and we said, this is what we want to do, this is what we thought we were approving, this is actually what the boards went and toured, right? And looked very specifically at that. And we don't do that for all these projects, but we specifically did it for this project as well as some others. And that's not, we didn't get what we paid for, what we thought we paid for, and that's the frustration. And because that ed spec, or rather that conceptual design wasn't priced, we're never going to know whether that original design would have had us over just as much as we are now. I mean, I guess it's plausible that it could have. It's also plausible that maybe it wasn't going to be over as much. So that's the frustration you hear from this board, because what we're trying to do is make sure we get what we pay for, and we're efficient in doing it. And to go into the legal discussions and say, what do we need to do in a bond resolution, that's a difficult and challenging thing to try to contemplate. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm going to support Mr. Walsh's motion. I did serve on a committee on building committees about 10 years ago. We had one of those. And I think it's about time we look at this process from soup to nuts again, so that we stop with these constant surprises. I will ask for liaisons from this board to larger building committees. Now, the issue with that is, we did have that process in the past, again, going back 8 to 10 years. And there wasn't a lot of attendance at those meetings, because A, you're non-voting, and B, you have other obligations related to this board. And other activities that you're involved in, and this takes a fair amount of time. That's why that went by the boards a number of years ago, but it's something that we can revisit. I think probably the Board of Ed had the same problems. I know the RTMs had similar problems, just because of all the different things that people do. But I will be asking for that as well. And I thank you for that recommendation. With that...
Well, I would like to say that I think it might be maybe not a liaison, but I think the building committee chair of each of any new building committee should have to come before this body at our quarterly meeting and supply us with all the minutes, with our package, so we can read it and ask any questions at that point in time.
Well, and I think that that's something that this committee we're going to form can put in their recommendation. Right? I think let's not predefine the answer. Let's form the committee and go forward with that. Mr. DeWitt.
Just one quick comment to, first off, I agree with Mr. Walsh's motion, and I'd volunteer to be on the committee.
Did I just hear you volunteer to chair it? No.
I'll volunteer to chair it.
Go ahead.
But interesting point, someone talked about Holland Hill. February this year, we did what we've never done before, which was bond money for a school project before we had anything, $1.24 million, just to make sure that we had the right data to go into this next building committee. So, you know, one of the ladies talked about the human aspect of this. I'm a little upset to hear that people don't think we take into account the human aspect of this thing, because we're supposed to be dollars and cents. But I think that's taken into account, and I think that particular motion and that particular bond talks about just that we want to make sure that this thing's done the right way the first time. And again, it's $1.24 million at risk, because we might never go forward with the project. So there are things moving in the positive direction.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. With that, if there's no other comments, does anybody want to take a look briefly at the bond resolution language? Does anybody have any questions on that? Mrs. Leclerc.
Okay, I'd like to ask bond counsel if it would be okay if we attach the handout that we received, so there is no doubt as to the budget that we think we're approving. Okay. It's a PowerPoint presentation, it's 11 pages. It has a budget on the last
More than welcome
page.
to look at it. Oh, yeah.
And if not, I'm going to ask you to make a motion to put that as part of it. Okay? Great, you're asking him to review an 11-page document, and he's paid by the minute.
Yeah. It,
You're on the word "the."
Let me run home quick and get it for you. I borrow mine? Yeah. It's really the next to last page.
It's the last
The
pa- right.
next to last page really has the breakout of the 3.97 million.
Funding
That's
request
what-
page.
Sorry?
right,
The next to last page.
page 11.
Sorry, last page, my bad.
Page 11.
3.907,674.
I'd be fine with just page 11 if that's better.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't attach the entire
Okay.
thing, because it's, I mean, what you really want to do is tie something to the funding. I will point out that the couple things, the discrepancy, I mean, the grand total on page 11, and I can't explain the difference, is $3,907,674. And you're being asked here for an additional $3,494,301.
No, we're being asked for 3,907,674.
Okay. And the second question, and I don't know if it's material or not, and maybe the first selectman has to address that, but this is not part of the motion that was passed on to you by the Board of Selectmen.
Okay, so is your position that we can amend that by attaching it?
Well, I honestly guess, I'm not opposed to that. I just don't know what you get by attaching this as opposed to just funding I don't know what the funding request breakdown gets you more than what you already have.
Mrs. Leclerc, do you want to say what you're trying to achieve?
I certainly would not be opposed. I'm certainly never opposed to somebody referring to this and having the minutes reflect this.
I guess in the past, I thought we were told that we could attach this, and because the Board of Finance is the one who actually approves the bond resolutions, that it was okay for us to do that after approval.
I don't think he's saying it's not okay. I think he's saying that he's not sure what it gets you.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not okay. If you want to attach the page 11, it's fine. I just don't know what it gets you
Mr.
beyond what you already have. I think it is probably
Clarification as to the details of what we think we're approving.
I think it would be just as important for the minutes to reflect that, as they probably do, that you had this presentation, you went through this, and what you think you're funding is what's on page 11.
I think that's fine. Can we, I'm not saying don't make that motion, I'm saying, can we make sure that the minutes do reflect and have a copy of that presentation as well as the page 11 on that, just as belt and suspenders, Mr. Tetra?
Just to clarify the operating rules, when we do non-recurring,
Yeah.
I think it was one of the enhancements made by this board, we break out the 10 different projects, we have a specific dollar amount for each one, and that's specifically so we don't move money from one project to another. If you're going to attach a line item budget, does that mean if any one of those line items changes, do you want somebody coming back before all three boards?
No, that's not the intent.
Well, my question is to Attorney Stoughton, what are we actually accomplishing by breaking that out?
I think he said nothing, right?
I think
Probably said it.
I think you're probably accomplishing nothing, and again, I think you probably are overly complicating this. I mean, the you're telling the building committee now they have $3,907,674 more to do the project, okay? But there are line items in here, and I'm assuming that you're not telling them they need to adhere to each line item within the estimate.
Is that what?
What if they put another cafeteria on for $13,907,000? What tells us after tonight that we told them our only allocated money is to go finish the windows?
Well, the challenge
Nothing.
this challenge
Oh.
this evening has been costs running over, not getting 2 cafeterias for the 11.6, but getting.
I would contend that part of the other challenge is that the money was allocated to, instead of allocating to buckets, it was allocated to 2 particular projects rather than 3. But
I think the minutes of the meeting will also reflect that the chair of the building committee said that the other 2 phases are completed. I think that question was asked twice, okay? And I think that certainly if Mrs. Leclerc wanted to suggest that the board was approving the funding pursuant to this presentation, the total funding amount and the project as outlined on page 11 of this funding request, I think that's entirely appropriate and it should be in the minutes.
And to Mr. DeWitt's point, I believe Attorney Stafford has said earlier, what took place on this is that all the money is spent on things defined in the bond resolution. Had the building committee spent things on something that wasn't defined in the bond resolution, as you just suggested, that would not be proper use of the bond funds.
that's not what I was saying. I was saying that there were 3 things in the bond resolution, and they spent money on 2.
And Mr.
Right
DeWitt-
now, there's a
right.
bond resolution that's now going to have 3 things in it still, and there's nothing in here that says, I think to Mrs. Leclerc's point, $3,907,624 is going to be only put toward windows.
It's true.
And I thought, less than an hour ago, bond counsel said, add more detail. Maybe I misinterpreted that.
Mr. Becker?
Yeah, so I get where you're going with the minutes, but I mean, we could pour into all these approval meetings and then the minutes and then everything that doesn't happen despite what everyone comes to us and says they're going to do, and that's all in the minutes. So I do agree with maybe adding something, but maybe we're looking at maybe too much by putting, that particular sheet in, but what about just very minorly, and I don't think it'd be substantive, which would really not require us to go back up through VOS or anything like that, but in the third whereas component, it mentions completing the remaining component. What if we were to then just add, which is the windows, or something to that effect, to point specifically they cannot go
Can you make that
anywhere else?
in the form of a motion, Mr. Sassman? Could you help him?
Yeah, if you want me to know exactly.
No, I
best
see
way,
what
but-
I see what you're saying, but if you go back to the whereas clause before that,
Okay.
the whereas clause before that defines the remaining component, which is what the additional funding for is the new windows, doors, and
Windows.
environmental remediation. So if you look at what we
So
put
you-
into the second whereas clause as the remaining component,
See-
I think that
So you think-
probably does what you want, and I think it probably addresses Mr. DeWitt's concern.
So you're
When taken
comfortable that
together,
that-
you think?
that basically
I
defines
think this
it well?
whereas clause said, what it says is the original resolution is not sufficient to cover all components, and what you're agreeing to fund is the remaining
Go with that.
component, which is defined as the new windows and doors and
all
environmental
they can spend it on,
conditions,
is this.
probably addresses the issue.
Yeah, that's all they can spend on is this. Yep.
Where did,
Are you all set?
No, here, it says,
Well-
whereas the original resolution is not sufficient to cover all, it is now sufficient to cover all the big components. So basically, it says that extra money is.
So what we're saying here is that the
Remaining
original,
component.
we're saying the original resolution was sufficient to cover everything
Yep.
but the windows, and we're defining this.
Got it.
So I would suggest this resolution is suggesting that all you're authorizing the funding is the remaining component, which is the windows, the doors, and the environmental.
Yep, and it's already been stated that
Right.
the other 2 components are completely done.
But you
As
just said,
to
you
your
just
other
said something a few minutes ago. 11,630,000 plus the 3,907 does not equal that 15, that's the wrong number. 15,124,000 is not,
Yeah, that's correct. I was going to mention that when you got
oh,
done.
okay, yeah.
The actual number should be 155.
So are we all set here?
As he gives us the right number. We
Yeah.
we have to amend the resolution to,
Yeah, and that third whereas, the 15124,301 should be 15537,674.
Mr. DeWitt, can you make that recommendation, or rather amendment?
I make a motion to amend the resolution under the third whereas statement, the last number to be $15,557,674.
Do we have a second to that? Mr. Stone, this last act. No. Any discussion on that amendment? Yeah. All in favor? Opposed, abstentions? Okay, the item is before us as amended. I'm just going to read from the charge here. Here, consider and adopt a bond resolution entitled "A Resolution Amending and Restating a Resolution Adopted by the Representative Town Meeting on June 24, 2013, entitled "A Resolution Appropriating $11,630,000 for the costs associated with the expansion and renovation of Fairfield Ludlow High School, and authorizing the issuance of bonds to finance such appropriation to increase the amount of the appropriation in bond authorization by $3,907,674 to the total of, give me the number,
15 million.
537.
557.
674.
557.
I got it, 537.
557, do the math.
Yep.
$15,557,674.
That's what I said.
But, and Mr. Chairman, it also needs to be changed under resolved number 1 and resolved number 2. Those, it quotes the number.
We've
3
changed
times.
it, right, the total, thank you. And all in favor of this resolution? Opposed? Opposed?
No.
Oh, you didn't oppose?
No.
Oh,
I'm
you're
in
in
favor
favor.
of it.
Opposed?
It smells, but I'm in favor.
I don't,
of it.
excuse,
Abstentions?
900.
I don't know where you get the 57.
37.
All right.
It's 37.
Yeah, it's,
I mean, 3 plus 0 is 3.
yeah, we just approved the additional funding, yeah.
It's had to be a little bit snarky. You
Okay.
didn't say anything all night.
537.
All right, now, Mr. Walsh, you have a
We did the
motion?
number wrong the first time.
Yeah, I'm waiting for somebody to second it.
Go ahead, well, make your motion, please.
All right. I make a motion to establish a committee of this Board of Finance to be called the Building Committee Review Committee that will investigate what occurred with the cost overruns of the Fairfield Ludlow High School Building Committee, and to make a recommendation to the Board of Finance of the ways to improve the Building Committee charge and building process to prevent cost overruns on building projects in the future.
So,
Do we have a second? We have a second, Mr. DeWitt, so the item is now before us.
it's a special meeting. We actually can't add a separate item, correct? As much as I totally,
Good point.
totally agree.
It's a
But
continuation. It's a
I
continuation of the other-
notice as I just don't want to trip up.
Fine, then if we can't.
Actually,
we'll do-
actually, he's right.
Not necessarily need a vote. I think the chairman can
He's
just
right,
form it,
he's right
but-
procedurally. I would like to make this a full item on the next, on our next regularly scheduled meeting. Full, let's just talk about the whole thing again, and we'll go from there.
And I know, I totally
The
agree
budget
with
time
doing
on
it. I just don't
No,
want it
I
to
think
be
it's
form
great, David.
drawn and then have a
You-
problem later on.
You are procedurally correct, and I think we'll all welcome the time to talk about it again at the next full meeting.
Is there going to be a motion?
You're going to miss it.
Is there going to,
Actually, since this was a.
I therefore withdraw my motion, but I'm asking the chairman to make
I
this a
don't know,
full
just
item,
resident, so we don't-
and I'll give you a list of people I'd like to talk at that meeting, including the Board of Ed, First Selectman.
Can I have another item then?
What?
Adjournment.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
First,
can I
do we
just
have
say
a
one
second?
thing before
Mr.
you adjourn,
DeWitt.
just real
Yes.
quick?
Well, no,
I'm-
I already did it, I'm sorry.
Well, I was raising my hand, he didn't look over here,
Sorry.
so that's okay.
All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Good night, everybody.
Mr. Walsh.
It's been withdrawn, we can't talk about it, so you don't even have to put it in the minutes. No, it's not even part of the meeting anymore. We couldn't make the motion.